I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, welcome back to VLGA Connect. It's time for another TGU panel discussion on all things local government. And gosh, what a week it's been, Julie Reid, with lots of planning and housing announcements, which I'm keen to get your take on shortly. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Chris. It has been a very busy week. We thought we were going to maybe have a shorter session this week, but there's too much news on the
There's
table.
lots happening, and of course, we're right on the knocker for the election, with the last day as we record this of voting or being able to get your completed ballot packs in the mail. And Tony, another surprise this week: the new regulations for the governance and integrity reforms got royal assent, and everyone's been going across the detail of this. And I think a couple of surprises, fair to say.
Yeah. So we knew it was coming, but perhaps we thought that it would largely reflect the consultation paper put out in August of this year. But the final version of the Model Code of Conduct has quite a few differences there, besides some just language changes to simplify and clarify. For example, in the theme around performing the role of a councillor, there's explicit provisions now about respecting the ruling of the mayor as chair at council meetings, refraining from public comment that could be perceived to be an official comment on behalf of the council where you're not authorised by the mayor.
So Tony, to be clear, and we just jumped straight into that. I didn't even say hello, Tony, and welcome to you from Hunt and Nunn Lawyers. We've just got straight to the detail. But these things that you're talking about, these were not in the draft that was socialised. Is that what you're saying? They've come in at the last minute.
Certainly, in terms of the model code of this explicit language in the model code of conduct, they weren't there. One might argue that they were implied, but the explicit language has been added in.
Right.
Things like, also around behaviours. So they've added in explicit language that, the conduct rules apply to the treatment of both other councillors, members of council staff, and members of the public. Now, we might have assumed that they were meant to apply in that way, but it's been made explicit. There's been added language included around the obligations to comply with reasonable instructions of the CEO to manage health and safety risks in the workplace. So I think one would say that some of the lobbying, the responses to the request for to the consultation process from many of the representative bodies have been picked up, which I think is a good thing and makes for a better, final version of the document.
Tony, given the conversations we've had many times on the challenges that CEOs have in this space with councillors and conduct, what does this do to improve, if at all, the CEO's ability to manage some of those really vexed issues?
Yeah, I think that'll be seen in the delivery and over the forthcoming months. But that would clearly be some intent there for that to be the case. And the addition of some of these, even these last minute, if you like, more explicit provisions, I think are clearly designed to be tools for whether it's CEOs, but probably more the case of internal arbitration processes to enforce councillors acting appropriately. There's another additional provision, I'd just say, that against a councillor making council information publicly available where that's contrary to the public interest. Now, that wasn't in the material that was put out in the consultation paper. Similarly, there's this explicit provision prohibiting a councillor from seeking preferential treatment in their personal dealings with council. So I think these are good additions and make the code of conduct more meaningful overall. So so certainly support those. It's a bit of a late rush for those of us who are involved in delivering the induction training, having to kind of focus and understand the new language, but I think that they'd largely be welcomed by the sector.
And I know you're both involved in that space. Julie, any thoughts on surprises or not with this for you?
Yeah, there was actually, Chris. And I mean, I think I agree with Tony that they've picked up quite a bit of what some of the different peak bodies have suggested be included, which is great. However, and also I believe that they've picked up some of the findings of the arbiters. So we've now got this, these case studies that have fed into this process, which is fantastic that that's done. But the one thing that's clearly missing for me is there's nothing around social media. We know that there's been a number of cases that have involved social media, and that social media has been a real problem for a lot of counsellors. And I know Tony's spoken about it a lot in the past with a lot of the cases. So nothing in there about a mandatory social media policy, nothing there that sort of constrains them around that. I'm a bit surprised not to see that. I thought that would have been a welcome addition, and, is missing. But, most councils will have a social media policy anyway. Let's hope that from the findings of those arbitration cases that there's some learnings there, and that could be weaved into those induction training courses that the councils are doing for the councillors. So we'll see how it goes. But at least now we've got a model code to work towards, the councils putting something together. It is a little bit late. It's last minute now scramble, but better late than never, hey?
So just on that, and a few people have picked up the social media element and the confidentiality element. There's been no actual announcement, unless I've missed it. The minister said nothing about this. The regulations just dropped, got royal assent. So it's a bit hard to know any reasoning behind why we've ended up, Tony, with what we've ended up with.
Yeah, that's true. It has just, as you say, just dropped. And whether there'll be any sort of practical guidelines or notes that follow remains to be seen. But I think, as Julie says, in practice, many councils will be adopting policies around things like social media and confidentiality. The question will be, though, how what authority those policies have at a councillor conduct panel level, at an arbiter level. We really don't know the answer to that. One might argue that implicitly the code of conduct says you follow the council policies, and that ought to encompass those, but certainly an explicit provision would give a lot more strength to that.
And I think in that space, councils do need to make sure that if they have got social media policies, that it's really clearly articulated in those policies about, how councillors can, use social media, etc. So I think as long as it's explicit, I think if it is a policy that's endorsed by council, then I suspect that the arbiters will take that into account without having any other guidance that's necessarily out there. So, yeah.
All right, I suspect we'll be coming back to that as people digest these new regulations with a bit more to be said in the coming weeks. It's not lost on me, and I've noticed a couple of others have noticed this too, that this has come out in the last week of an election period where councils and elected reps particularly are curtailed from being able to say much, certainly through council channels. Likewise, lots of housing and planning related announcements this week. The big one, I guess, was on the weekend when the government announced an eventual 50, but the first 25 new train and tram zone activity centres, Julie, to activate, what people are assuming will be high-rise housing around train stations. Two councils, at least, Glen Eira and Stonnington, have been pretty strong in their reaction to this dropping again out of the blue.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. It's really poor timing from the government, I think, around the fact that councillors cannot have a say during this period, but the CEOs of a couple of councils, as you say, have come out quite strongly and sort of criticised, I suppose, the fact that this has dropped at a really critical time where there's no voice from elected members that are representing those communities. So it's poor timing in that respect. But
Is it by design? Can I play devil's advocate?
I don't know, Chris. We can play devil's advocate. We can say it possibly could have been. It might just have fallen accidentally. Who knows?
There's a lot. I'm interested in Tony's view. There's a lot of detail in these announcements. We've had, train and tram zone activity centres. We've had a review of developer contributions. We've had,
Yep.
fast tracking of subdivisions, greenfields plans. They've been dropping day by day in the last week of the council election period. I'm going to go out on a limb here, Tony, and say it's by design.
Yeah. Look, I don't think there's much doubt in that in terms of the timing. I'll probably tackle you on the detail. I don't know that there is a hell of a lot of detail on some of the policy.
Well, at least there's
policies
been a
we've
lot of
seen,
thinking.
announcements.
There's been a lot of thinking
Yeah.
going into
Yeah.
these positions.
Yeah. And these issues have been around for quite some time, and we'll get to developer contributions in a minute. So, Tony, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, look, I think the general reaction is, as you say, that lack of consultation, but also that some of these announcements ignore the work that's been done by councils with their communities over many years. And Dale Dixon, CEO at Stonington, and Stonington are particularly affected. Let me say, I think 9 of the 25 most recently announced, activity centres were in Stonington. He makes the point that, Stonington already has, as he describes it, a comprehensive, evidence-based approach to future housing needs. It's based on substantial community engagement. And then this is sort of, the government has sort of gone over the top of that and introduced their own framework to deliver this additional housing that doesn't seem to have any element of community consultation attached to it, and so you can understand that why we might have these critical voices from local communities and local representatives. To me, I can understand the government's got a really difficult problem that they're trying to solve here, but I think fundamentally, that sort of command system approach, or even quite socialist in a way, where we're telling people where they should live. It to me, I don't know how. I just don't think it's going to be particularly successful. When you look at where new immigrants move to, the city of Stonington have 3, 4, 5 maybe citizenship ceremonies a year, with maybe like 100 people taking Australian citizenship at each one. Well, the city of Wyndham has 60, with 300 people at every citizenship ceremony. So, people are settling into those outer areas for a reason. They want to have a bit of land, that sort of stuff. I mean, I agree that there's a group in the community, perhaps the younger generation, that would like to move in apartments, and perhaps at the other end as people are downsizing. But the large group that are needing to be housed, I think are being housed on the fringes. And I just wonder whether this sort of command approach is going to work.
So the government's announcements this week have included tackling all ends of the spectrum, really. So subdivisions to put more houses on existing blocks, which removes backyards.
So what they're doing, Chris and Tony, is that they're trying to enable people to subdivide their suburban blocks and to allow a second house on their blocks. Now, as you know, previously the government announced how you didn't need to have a planning permit to have a granny flat in your backyard, and now what they're trying to do is speed up the subdivision of those blocks in those metro areas, particularly those suburban, middle ring suburbs where you can get 2 dwellings on a property. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to speed that up. They're trying to make sure that those gaps are filled, but they are recognising that there are constraints around that. They're talking about the fact that there are, many heritage overlays across properties in particularly some of the inner city areas, and therefore those heritage overlays will still apply, and there'll be restrictions around that. So that will be music to the ears of some of the councils that have those vast heritage overlay areas. So it's interesting that they're trying to unlock that, but they're also focusing on these other 50 new centres or not new centres, but 50 new areas that are going to be added to those activity centre lists. And they're focusing those obviously around public transport and transit sort of areas. So seven of those centres will be connected to the Metro Tunnel. And then what they've done is focused on each of the different lines, the Belgrave-Lilydale line, the Frankston line, and the Sandringham line. Now, I know for certain that in pretty much all of those areas, there's been significant strategic planning undertaken by those councils to have a look at what is capable of being able to be developed in those areas without compromising that neighbourhood character that the people in those centres actually really value. And so this is where the controversy is going to come, because the government are going to step in and say you need to be a lot higher than 4 stories, council, and so that's where there's going to be lots of concern from the communities around going higher, potentially in places like Brighton, Middle Brighton, Hampton and Sandringham. I can imagine that the communities down there are going to be very upset with the government around, what they might be proposing there. Now, they say that they're going to put together, I think, I think they're going to do more work on this. It's the detailed work they now need to do. I think they've probably done a lot of detailed work already in the background, Chris, but they will be doing a lot more detailed work around all of these activity centres.
You talk about some of those communities potentially being upset. Well, we've already seen some protests on the news, particularly when the announcement in Middle Brighton was made. Another element, and we haven't got time to unpack all of these today, but there is the greenfields element. So on one hand, removing backyards in more inner city areas and middle ring suburbs, as you say, to allow more subdivisions, more greenfield plans to allow people to build homes with backyards are being announced, and they're going to be rolled out as well. I guess the big question that goes with all of this, and it's a commonly asked question, is how is the infrastructure going to keep up? It's not there to support this growth now. And so now we've got this review of developer contribution schemes, which I think has been roundly welcomed.
Involved.
And that's
industry working group. Housing Industry Association, master builders, but no councils.
Well, they did say that they'll work out how councils can be involved after the election period. So at least they recognise that. But yes, it's very industry heavy, isn't it?
And, it is. And Julie, you're an ex-planner. I mean, what about a 10-day statutory? 10 statutory days for councils to make a decision about a dual occupancy. I mean, who was arguing that 60 days was too long? 10 just seems, I don't know how council stat planning departments are going to make these decisions in 10 days.
The only way you can do that is without consultation. That's the only way you can, because you can't go out to consultation on over 10 days. So, it just means that the community are out of the equation, which is not what councils are going to want. So, it's a really interesting and ambitious target.
But also, it's going to require more planners, isn't it?
Oh,
where are they coming from?
And where are they? Where are they? They're just not out there. And I know that they're trying to focus on programs. They have already announced a sort of a program around, trying to increase the planners and get them particularly out to the regions. But we're talking about a lack of supply and a huge demand. And, does that mean that the government will say, okay, well, we'll deal with all of those in the state at the state level, and they're exempt from, councils are are excluded from
Yeah.
dealing with those applications, and we'll deal with it centrally. I don't know, and then we'll just process them and don't consult with the community. It's quite a that's quite a challenge. But anyway, look, they're saying with all of it, they're going to actually, with the activity centres, they're saying they're going to run a pilot program. That'll be interesting to see how that rolls out and what kind of response they get to all of that. Going back to the issue of the developer contributions, this has been floating around for a while. There was a specialist advisory committee that was set up a number of years ago that made recommendations to the minister about what should happen to that developer contribution system. Now, that's been sitting on a shelf for quite some time. I know that it was presented to the minister before the election. So there would have been it's been sitting there bubbling away now. Probably a very good time to roll that out from the government's perspective, because people are going to be asking the same questions as what you're asking, Chris. So they're saying,
Yeah.
okay, well, we've got this plan now for contributions, which will feed into that infrastructure demand and need, which is interesting timing. So you wonder whether or not there's been a plan for some time for all of this to be rolled out, and then now is the time to release it, because the government are saying housing is the number one issue
Yeah.
for them.
I just had an idea, Chris and Julie. This is
Yep.
about providing homes to people. Richard White, the ex-CEO of WiseTech's looking for a job. He's quite good at houses to people. Maybe the government should appoint him.
That's right. Well, they're not very popular with some of their appointments at the moment, are they? They've got, they've got to fill the top job in the Department of Planning and Transport, which is is coming under some scrutiny, and the media
Yes.
are watching that one really carefully, aren't they, Chris?
They certainly are. Some speculation this week that Jerome Weimar might be in line for that. I think it'll be a little while before we know. All right, so that's probably enough on all of those different elements of the announcements that have come out this week. There's lots of material online. There will be more, no doubt. And I imagine once the election's over and we get some new mayors and councillors in office, there'll be some more comment from councils on how they see their role in that. The MAV has put out a pretty measured statement this week calling for a cooperative approach to all of these issues to solve the housing crisis, which you'd expect.
And sorry, Chris, and a
Yeah.
strong reaction from Glen Eira as well, which,
Yes.
not only Stonington, but Glen Eira have come out with strong statements as well. So worth having a look at that. Some of the other councils may be jumping on the back of that as well.
Yes, I've only seen Rebecca at Glen Eira and Dale at Stonington at this point. A CEO that probably isn't going to comment on this stuff because he's got other things on his mind is John Baker at Mornington Peninsula Shire, who it's been revealed this week is leaving our state and heading up to the Sunshine Coast. Well, why wouldn't you want to? He's taking on the top job at the Sunshine Coast Council in December, which is a really big gig and a great win for John.
Oh, and I'm delighted for him, Chris, because he's a great operator, is John, and you should see all the lovely comments that are coming out on LinkedIn about John and his leadership and what he's done down at Mornington Peninsula. He's such a delight to work with, and has done some really great things for Mornington Peninsula. This would be a natural next step, I think, for John. I think that going to the Sunshine Coast sounds delightful. It's probably something that he would really enjoy, and no doubt it seems as though they're very pleased to have got someone of John's caliber, because obviously
Yes.
John has significant experience now as a CEO in Victoria, but he's also worked for major organisations.
Yes, in Australia and in the UK.
In the UK, and
Yeah.
brings a wealth of knowledge and some great ideas to the table. So well done to John, and well done to Sunshine Coast. And I'm feeling for Mornington Peninsula at the moment, because I'm sure the staff are quite sad that John's going to be leaving in December.
Yeah, the Mornington Peninsula News, I think it's called, has published John's letter to staff, which is it's worth a read. Really
Yeah.
nice sentiments. He's reflected on his time there and what he sees as the key achievements, and an 81% staff rating of people who are happy to come to work. So another one of those culture change agents. I think he's done really
Mm.
good work inside a council organisation in difficult times, it should be said, particularly with COVID right in the middle of his period of time there. Guys, a lot of news this week, and we don't want an hour and a half because it tests people's stamina, I think. So let me just throw a few things at you and just get some quick fire responses. So Paul Guerra and these are election related, of Vecchi this week said because there's so many residents coming into the city of Melbourne, the business vote is diluted, and 2 votes for businesses might not be enough. 3 or more should be required so that business has more of a say. What do we think about that proposition, Tony?
Look, I don't think it's going to get up from the lukewarm reaction it's received from both sides of state politics. I think, CBDs of major cities are unique in that, the non-residents play a major role, typically employers and businesses in those CBDs, and that's why they're significant stakeholders. They should have a significant say in their vote to be emphasised. Whether it requires more emphasis, I think, is a moot point. I doubt that'll get up. But Paul Guerra certainly has the ear of some of the council candidates. I think a number of them have appointed him to some roles on council moving forward.
Yeah.
And there was an article in The Age this week that suggested if it wasn't for that skewed vote towards business, Melbourne would be likely to vote along the lines that it does at state and federal level, and would be looking at a likely Greens Lord Mayor in Roxanne Ingleton. But the current voting structure probably makes it a bit hard for her to get up, Julie.
Yes, I'd say so, Chris. Yeah, look, it'll be interesting to see. I know that there's a lot of pressure coming on to the mayoral candidates, as Tony has mentioned, and depending on who gets in, there could be quite a bit of focus on the businesses and supporting the businesses in the city of Melbourne. So let's wait and see what unfolds.
Chris, what I would say about mayoral candidates, though, I did watch the replay. It was of the Lord mayoral debate.
Yes.
4 of the lead candidates on there, and what struck me was how cordial, how polite. No one spoke over each other. There was no sort of jibes and that sort of stuff. I reckon state and federal politicians could learn a bit from the conduct of our council or candidates here. We get a bit of we get a bad run in the media sometimes, but yeah, if you get a chance, have a look at the replay. Very cordial, very polite, very respectful, and all got their points across.
Excellent, excellent. So, and there's some international figures that perhaps could learn from that too, Tony. ABC News has done a story this week on why there's so many monitors in place at Victorian councils, 12 at the start of the term, because Whittlesea, Casey are being added to the list. And I wanted to throw this thought at you. Peter Stevenson, the administrator at Strathbogie, says that there's more poor governance at Victorian councils, potentially, that it's because of a post-COVID, I'm not going to follow the rules mentality, which has seeped into, I would assume, elected representatives. Do we think that's a fair call?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think I've got a general view. Sometimes when you come up with laws that many in the public don't follow, or a large proportion of them don't follow, then you create this general disregard for the rules. I think that might well have happened with some of the COVID lockdown provisions. I think that it was interesting, Peter Stevenson, who's now the administrator, but as you say, former monitor there at Strathbogie, he likened the monitor role to a coach, reviewing the governance, providing advice. I suppose a coach sometimes does report back to the owners about who should get sacked and not in the team. So maybe it's got some other analogies there. But look, it seems to be working, this monitor process, in that I think what's noteworthy is that in only 2 of the 15 monitor appointments this term have the councillors been dismissed ultimately, whereas last term we had 5 monitors appointed, and 4 out of the 5 times the council was dismissed. So the outcomes don't seem so extreme this time, and perhaps the monitor process is not an end process when all hope's lost, but it's a a turnaround process.
Proactive, preventative. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that sentiment as well, Tony. I think that it is much more proactive sort of approach, and I think that's why the minister is sending them in earlier, when there's a whiff of sort of a need for a coach that might assist the CEO and the mayor in making sure that the right policies are in place and the right behaviours are happening around the table. I think it's actually quite a positive thing, and I think most CEOs are now seeing this as not necessarily a failure of the council, but an extra resource to be able to help steer it in the right direction to avoid moving into maladministration and poor governance.
Yeah.
That's what I think it is.
So lots of reporting this week on different elements of the election. The Age has a story on 3 teenage candidates at, I think it was Bayside, Port Phillip and Hume, and a few other articles that are worth checking out if you have the time. It is, of course, election counting time next week. I don't think a lot of people realise that counting won't start until after the weekend. In fact, my mail is possibly not even till Tuesday. So we're going to be waiting a while for some results, unfortunately for us tragics who like to hang on the on the count. Just before we take a break, I want to note with sadness the passing of a former mayor of Greater Bendigo, Barry Lyons, who had motor neurone disease, has passed away at the age of 79. He was the mayor of Greater Bendigo for a time. He served on the council from 2008 to 2016 and goes back his councillor career back to the Shire of Romney pre-amalgamation, of course. I'm not sure, Tony, if you ever came across Barry, but some really nice tributes coming out for him and his contribution on his passing.
Don't remember coming across him personally, but he was a long-term licensee of the Windermere Hotel in Kangaroo Flat. So I might have frequented that place once or twice. But yeah, violated to him, and what a great contribution, as you say. Started in Romsey in the 70s and then in the 2000s in Greater Bendigo.
All right, on that note, Tony, Julie, if you'd like to have a cuppa and take a little break, we're going to head off to our Rhys snapshot this week. It's called The Great Reset with Rhys Thomas. Time to step across to VLGA Central, where Rhys Thomas awaits us with the Great Reset this week. Rhys, it's a rather unique time in the electoral cycle this weekend, isn't it?
Certainly is, Chris. It's a special time. It's election eve as we record this, and I know lots of governance officers will have 6 a.m. on Saturday, the 26th of October in their diary, and they've probably had it there for quite some time, because that's the moment when the current councillors at least, go out of office.
I do remember quite regularly in my governance background, you are often asked the question by councillors, exactly when am I not a councillor anymore? Well, that's it, 6 a.m. on election day.
That's right. I often follow up that question is, why? What did you have in mind? But anyway,
yes.
Look, it wouldn't be an election eve if we hadn't had some very last minute regulatory or legislative change. And of course, that happened this week. We got the governance integrity regulations were given royal assent on Tuesday. So, it's last minute, probably not ideal, but at least we've got some certainty in this space.
There's not been a lot said about them, though, Rhys.
No, I haven't seen a formal announcement yet. From what I understand, there's significant guidance material going to be published by Local Government Victoria to accompany them, and I imagine the finalisation of that is holding them up. Hopefully that will happen pretty soon. So if it doesn't come, if I've missed it today, then it maybe it's out, but if I haven't missed it, then I'm certainly hoping it's out next week.
Yeah. Okay. So there's an important change in here in terms of one of the first things that councils and governance officers need to be mindful of.
Absolutely. And look, I flagged it last week, and that is the wording of the oath or affirmation of office for councillors. It's changed. So every governance officer needs to be aware of that, because you'll recall, Chris, earlier this year at Brisbane City Council, the governance officers there presumably pulled out an old template, and the councillors all took the wrong oath. And
Yes.
because it wasn't actually picked up until after they'd had their ceremonial meeting, they actually needed to do it again and conduct their election for deputy mayor and some committee positions. They had to do it all again. So that's what would happen if a council here gets it wrong. So don't get it wrong, is my advice.
Not an embarrassment that we'd be wishing upon anyone.
No, I don't think so. Make sure it's right. The key is the wording has to refer to the model code of conduct instead of the councillor code of conduct. So if it has the word model in it, in a couple of places, then you know you've got the right word. So the actual wording is in the regulations which were signed off earlier this week. You're looking
And
for
we don't
the
want to
word
repeat of what happened back in 2016, Rhys. I don't know if you were in the thick of that one. I certainly was, and it was a pretty tough time there for a few weeks.
Yeah, the council I was at, we got lucky just by circumstance because we'd accidentally done it the correct way. But yeah, you're right. You're referring to a situation when a bunch of councillors failed to sign off the councillor code of conduct, which was a requirement back then. They didn't do it exactly correctly, wasn't witnessed correctly, which actually meant that a whole series of councillors, had it not been for a legislative change, would have actually gone out of office. So you can't rely on a legislative change to fix an error you make. Make sure it's got the word model in the oath you take.
Yes. So when does that need to happen?
Well, it really doesn't matter in some ways, and different councils do it differently. It's always been my practice to encourage councillors to take the oath fairly early. But there's essentially two ways that councils do it. Some do it as soon as the decision is known, they take the oath, and that actually might mean that different councillors take the oath at different times. And other councils wait until the ceremonial of the first council meeting and have all the councillors take the oath at that meeting together. Now, the problem with that second approach is that you don't actually become a councillor until you've taken the oath, which means that you're not bound by the councillor code of conduct or the model councillor code of conduct. I'm going to have to learn those new words. And you're not bound by confidentiality provisions and other things. So it's been my view that the best approach is to take the oath fairly early with the councillors. And then if you want to, there's nothing to stop you doing it a second time for ceremonial purposes at that meeting at which you elect the mayor.
Right.
Just make sure that if you do it twice like that, that the paperwork that you sign reflects that first oath that is taken with the CEO, because that's the official one.
But taking it in that scenario, taking it early means you can get a head start on some of those other activities like induction, etc.
It does. It does also mean that the clock is ticking, because the clock on the completion of your induction program needs to be, starts ticking the minute the councillors take the oath. So just make sure that you've got your 4-month plan for delivering induction program will fit within 4 months of the taking of the oath.
And that's also the trigger for the start of payments of councillor allowances?
It is. And this is one of the reasons why councillors often do like to take the oath fairly early, because they're doing a lot of early work in those first few weeks, part of induction and onboarding. So it's only reasonable that they receive a councillor allowance for it. And you can't pay an allowance until they've taken the oath, because that's when they become a councillor. And for governance officers that haven't been through it before, there's a few quirks about paying the allowances. One is make sure you don't pay councillors an allowance for the gap between election day and when they take the oath. There's not an allowance payable for that period of time. And also your elected mayor and deputy mayor, their allowance is higher, but there will be a period between when they take the oath and when they get elected. That is, if you've taken the oath on a day earlier than that ceremonial meeting, there'll be a period for which a councillor allowance is payable, and then that increases to pay the mayoral allowance once they get elected into that office. So it's a little bit complicated. You might need to pull out your spreadsheet to figure that one out, but yeah, just think about it logically and map it out that way.
Yeah, the latter might be an argument for ensuring that the election of the mayor and everything and their swearing of the oaths all happen at the same time. I guess councils need to weigh those up.
It can be easier that way, yeah.
Yeah. You talked a bit last week about an issue you detected with council websites and the donation returns from the last election. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, look, it relates essentially to the privacy of what after tomorrow will be ex-councillors. So councillors are obviously public officers while they're in office, and there's a whole lot of transparency provisions that go along with that. So one of those was the election campaign donation return summaries that I talked about last week. And another one is the personal interest returns that they complete. So that's the document that where they disclose properties that they own, companies that they might have interests in, their employment arrangements, and some other things that could constitute a conflict of interest. Now, after tomorrow's election, councillors will no longer be councillors, which means that they're no longer officers defined under the Act as people who have to submit one of these returns. Now, there seems to be different views on this subject, and I've spoken to both Local Government Victoria and the Local Government Inspectorate around what we should do about historical publications. So the publications that exist now of what will soon be ex-councillors. Now, there's a trade-off here between transparency and privacy, and it's always been my practice when a councillor leaves the organisation, or for that matter, a member of staff leaves the organisation, it's been my practice to remove the references to them from that personal interest return summary. Similarly, it's always been my practice to only publish the most recent personal interest return summary, because that's all that's required under the Local Government Act. And without that requirement, it's my view that any publication constitutes a breach of the Privacy and Data Protection Act. But that's not a universal view. And there are many councils that publish historical personal interest returns, sometimes going back right through the term of council or even into the previous term. So I don't have a position. I don't have an answer for people. I can't tell you what to do. But I think it's probably worth governance officers giving some thought to that, and giving some thought to the rights of councillors now that they're returning to private life and the privacy protections that should apply.
I think worth highlighting, because they may not have given those issues much thought at all, and you've raised some very good reasons, it seems, sound reasons why they should consider those issues. It's a shame there's no clear and definitive guidance on that, Rhys.
Another tip for governance officers who haven't been through an election cycle before: in almost every respect, when a new council is elected, you'll get a mixture of brand new councillors and councillors who are returning to office. And all the legislative provisions for them are the same. So if you've returned to office, you've been a councillor, you might have been a councillor for 20 years, you still have to go through the full induction program. If you get elected to mayor and you've been the mayor before, that doesn't matter. You still have to go through the full induction program. So there's no difference between returning councillors and incoming councillors, with one exception, and that relates to the personal interest returns. So personal interest returns will have to be filled out by newly arriving councillors, what's called an initial personal interest return. That's the first one you do. But for returning councillors, they don't have to do that. They're existing, they will have already filled out a biannual personal interest return, the one they do every 6 months, and that's sufficient. So this is the one difference. So for governance officers who've got a number of returning councillors, you don't need to send them the initial personal interest return. You just need to send it to the people who've not been councillors before. If a councillor has been a councillor before but isn't a councillor today, so in a previous term, they will need to fill out initial personal interest return. And in fact, that includes the councillor that resigned from office just last week. They will have to, they're not a councillor today, so they'll have to do that.
Yes, there's some nuance there. Any final housekeeping notes before we wrap up?
Just around the councillor code of conduct and the model councillor code of conduct. With the making of those regulations, the model councillor code of conduct is now the document in force, and there's a requirement that councils publish that on their website. So get yourself a copy of the regulations and extract the model councillor code of conduct from that, or publish the regulations in full, but publish that on your website, and remove the existing councillor code of conduct, because that document is no longer in force. With the model councillor code of conduct, I know some councils have been in the habit of sending their councillor code of conduct to the council for some sort of endorsement. Now, there's no legal requirement now to do that, because the document isn't adopted by the council any longer. But that wouldn't stop you, if you wanted to send it to the council to vote to endorse it or vote to commit to it. In my view, that's probably unnecessary because the oath of office or affirmation of office that they take includes specific words that as an individual they commit to that document. And the last thing you want to do is send it to the council for adoption or signing as a group and have one councillor vote against that. That would not be a great way to start the term. So
now that you've said that, I reckon that's going to happen. We'll keep an eye out. Let's hope it doesn't, but
hope not.
a fair chance. So with this late dropping of the regulations, I guess there's some devil in the detail that we're yet to really be able to talk about. Do you think perhaps next week we can get into it in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I'm going to flesh it out a little bit, and I'll be sending some communication to our members specifically, but I'll come back next week and we'll talk about it. There are a few changes, including, you'll recall at a previous chat, I talked about the need to develop a councillor social media policy and a councillor confidentiality policy. Neither of those documents are mandatory now, as it turns out. They've decided not to proceed with that. So I'm going to come back next week and talk about the implications of that and what the alternative approach might be.
Yes, I have picked up on some disappointment in various parts of the sector that has not been the case. So I guess it's an important one for us to be mindful of. Look forward to chatting about that next week.
I don't think it's going to be as bad as some people think. So
Right.
yeah, I'll come back and explain that next week.
Excellent. Thank you, Rhys. Great to talk to you as always. That's been the Great Reset here on VLGA Connect. Thanks as always to Rhys. Always some insights, and look forward to that discussion next week after he's had some time to really digest the model councillor code of conduct. Tony and Julie are back with me now. Some news this week out of Tasmania, Tony, where the local government minister there, Nick Street, has stepped down from his ministerial responsibilities for mental health reasons. And, you know, kudos, and lots of kudos coming for him highlighting this issue and taking this step for his well-being.
Yeah, we wish him all the very best. 8 years as a member of parliament there so far in Tasmania, and you know, like the Jeremy Rockcliffe, the premier, we wish him all the very best. Nick Street.
Kerry Vincent, a long-time mayor of Sorell Council in Tasmania, who was recently elected to the parliament, has now been announced as the new local government minister in Tasmania. So all the best to him in that role. Julie, an extraordinary story out of Western Australia where a councillor from Port Hedland has headed to Russia, spoken at the BRICS conference with Vladimir Putin there, and praised Russia's democracy and complained that he doesn't get to have any free speech in Australia. And the Western Australian Premier has said he's an embarrassment and he should resign.
Oh boy, I know, Chris. I thought we did have a free speaking country here, and that, you know, we can debate issues and councillors can debate issues and they can, you know, talk to the community freely. I find this a little bit frustrating.
Yeah.
What are they actually wanting to say? So I think I've got a little bit of empathy for the premier there around this particular issue, because I think that, you know, maybe that's a little bit harsh.
He wants to be able to talk more openly about COVID-19 vaccines.
Yeah, well,
the
he did
Ukraine
get
war.
a motion up around Pfizer and Moderna, didn't
Yeah.
he? But
Is that a council issue though?
Well, some say no. The Premier of the state says no.
Yeah.
Right.
I think Putin's struggling to find some influential friends in the West. I mean, no disrespect to Port Hedland, but if he's sort of showcasing that he's got a councillor from Port Hedland there at, you know, this is a big international conference, you know, what is it? BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. What's the S?
Well done.
South Africa? Is that right?
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be.
I think it's South Africa, but, you know, and he's, so, you know, hasn't found the most, you know, a leading political identity in Australia.
No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yes, very, very good point. Let's keep that in context. Over in New Zealand, the local government minister has announced this week what the intervention into Wellington City Council will look like, and it's the appointment of a Crown Observer yet to be named. The council has 10 days to respond to this. The Mayor of Wellington, Tory Whānau, has accused the government of punching down on the council, and this has all stemmed, Tony, from a recent decision to amend their long-term plan and renege, if you like, on a sale of their share in the Wellington airport.
Yeah, that does sound pretty old world, doesn't it? A crown observer. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we'd call a monitor, but um, yeah, some deep concerns about financial management and the decision-making processes there in Wellington. And the mayor, her surname escapes me, but
Fano.
Tory, yeah,
Yeah,
yes,
Fano.
yeah,
Yeah.
is being quite vocal about, as you say, council of embracing this process, taking it on, but assuring the public that the council have got things under control.
What's concerning apparently some other councils, Julie, in New Zealand is some have financial challenges and contentious councillors, and they're worried that they might be next.
Yes, well, no doubt the government is looking at this very closely, and we know that that's what governments do. They look over the finances of councils to make sure that they're financially sustainable into the future. So not surprising, Chris.
No, I guess it's not surprising. In the UK, there's a new survey out about the abuse of elected representatives. It's been done by the UK Local Government Association, and it's found that 1/5 of councillors have received a death threat or a threat of violence in their role, and nearly 3/4 have received abuse or intimidation in the last year. Alarming and disturbing stats.
They are, Chris. They're really, really scary. 1 in 10 counsellors had someone attend their home in a way that they considered intimidating or inappropriate.
Yeah,
43% had requested to withhold their home address from public duty due to safety concerns. Um, 10% experienced threat of damage to their property, and 11% considered that they needed modifications to their home security. This is
yeah,
incredible. And then you've got 19% that experience abuse, intimidation, relating to protected characteristics. So, sex was the most commonly cited characteristic for which respondents had suffered abuse or intimidation. Which year are we in, Chris? This
yeah,
is
yeah.
incredible. And then
Yeah.
57% of respondents reported that their authorities' arrangements for protecting counsellors were very or fairly effective. So there's going to be some change in that space, I think, Chris.
Well, there's certainly a call for change, and
Yeah,
this is why we all came together a few weeks ago for that Global Civility Summit that Diane Kaelin-Sucre in Canada put together. That's going to be an
that's right.
annual event, I believe, now, because this issue, Tony, is not going away.
No, no, well, it's not. And yeah, look, interesting stats. It's. I think the survey's based on, I think something like 10% of
1,700
councillors.
councillors, which is
Yeah,
10% of. It's a
yeah,
lot of councillors when you
it's
think
a
about.
pretty good
Yeah.
Yeah.
sample. So yeah, would suggest that things aren't going so well in terms of the respect and public regard for councillors in the UK.
Yeah.
Mm.
One final note, and I wonder if this is the start of something. Chippenham Town Council in the UK says it's leaving X, formerly known as Twitter, because it's had an increase in inappropriate content and a decline in engagement. They've given people about 10 days notice that they're going to disappear off the platform. Will anyone notice, do we think?
I don't think Elon
Look,
Musk will care. I think his $370 billion fortune won't. I think Twitter, or as it was called, it hasn't fared too well financially since Elon took it over, and he's running this kind of free speech, an open platform kind of policy. But I've gathered there's been drops in advertising revenue and this sort of stuff. Perhaps if a favourable president is elected, maybe things will be different for that platform. But I think you're right. I think we may well see some public organisations, even private ones, vote with their feet in terms of removing their presence from X.
I wonder whether it's already been happening, but they haven't, like this council, announced it quite
That's
so
right.
openly.
yeah,
I,
yeah.
I certainly don't go on X, as it's now called, anywhere near as frequently as I used to.
And it's interesting, Chris, because there is a trend of this. If you watch the ABC Breakfast News this morning, they interviewed Stephen Fry. Now, Stephen Fry is travelling around Australia at the moment, and you can go and have an evening with Stephen Fry. He used to be a huge user of Twitter. and he had something, I can't remember, it was many, many millions of followers on Twitter. He was an early adopter of
Yeah.
Twitter. Now, when it went to X, he made a comment that he was upset about the way that people are treating it and things that are being said and the inappropriateness of some of the stuff on there. So he withdrew from that as well. So because of that reason. So it's interesting that even high profile people like Stephen Fry, who had many, many followers, have also withdrawn from that. So there you go. There's a bit of a trend, not just in local government, but also across the world.
Love to hear from any of the people in councils watching or listening to this. Do you still use Twitter? Is it still part of your comms tools, or has it gone by the wayside? Or X, I should call it
X, yeah.
by its name. It'd be good to get a sense of whether that exodus has already happened, excuse the pun, at least here in Victoria. All
now,
right.
Chris, just before
yes.
we leave, I heard
Yes.
a rumour that the King Charles had visited a library this week in Sydney or outside of Sydney. So we were talking about it last week about whether or not he was going to, mix with a council in some way, shape or form. And I heard a rumour that he went to one of the libraries. So there you go. So, libraries are important and councils do great work in that space. And there you go. Good enough for King Charles to visit.
And I am aware that one of the New South Wales mayors managed to rub shoulders with him at one of those events as well. So there you go.
Fantastic.
Sydney and Canberra got all of the goodwill from that. Thank you, Julie. I hope you have a great week. Thanks for your insights as always here on TGU. And Tony, thanks to you and the team at Hunt and Hunt Lawyers for your support for the program and for your insights, which we always value.
Yeah, I'll be off to. I'm off to do a compare and contrast paper, and I'll put it out on LinkedIn on the announced regulations and the ones that were put out for consultation. So if you're interested in, you don't want to do the hard legwork of doing the compare and contrast yourself, just have a look on LinkedIn.
That saved us some time. We'll look out for that. Thank you.
Great
Thank you,
news.
Tony. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Julie. And thank you to you, the listener and viewer, for joining us as you do each week here on BLGA Connect. We'll be back with you very soon.